Okay, great. Aditya, we are ready to start. Given that we are terribly late, I will ask you the favor to crunch it to 20 minutes. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Daria, for organizing this event with Penny. You will remember that we did anticipate in the World Development Report the rise of geopolitics and how it might face a challenge for the multilateral trading system. Daria, am I hearing myself or is somebody else speaking?
You're hearing yourself, I'm afraid, but I don't know how to fix that.
But we are also hearing you very well.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So as I was saying that, we spoke in the WDR of how in the 19th century, Britain's commitment to being an upholder of the multilateral trading system then wavered when Germany and the United States caught up. And similarly, the US commitment to multilateralism seems to waver now that China has emerged as a geopolitical rival. Daria, I'll just ask you once more. For me, it's not a problem, but is there an echo for you guys?
Not at all. For us, it's perfect, but I'm sorry, we will nevertheless try to fix it in your end as well. Okay.
Okay, so in this paper, which is jointly with Michele Ruta and Bob Steger, we study the implications of geopolitical rivalry for trade cooperation generally, but more specifically also look at what geopolitics means for the role and the design of the multilateral trading system. The point of departure is the seminal work of Bagwell and Steger, who, as I hope all of you know, showed that the primary purpose of a trade agreement is to mitigate the effects of terms of trade externalities on trade policy choices. Essentially, large countries, by imposing import restrictions, reduce their demand for imports, push down the global price, and therefore are likely to choose, as we know, optimal tariffs that balance the advantage of improving their terms of trade against the internal distortions that tariffs cause. But if many large countries were to do the same thing, you'd get a non-cooperative equilibrium where nobody would improve their terms of trade and everybody would incur the cost of distortions. From this non-cooperative protectionist trap, the GATT WTO norms and rules allowed countries to escape and promoted mutually beneficial trade cooperation. This literature, however, I need to mute speakers at my end.
Yes, if you mute your speakers, then you won't hear yourself. Sorry, maybe it's less distracting.
Okay, give me 1 second if I can find.
And Michele, do you want to come here to the front so that?
I will speak now and just nod, Daria, if it's sounding fine to you. Great. Anyway, the key point is that this classical literature on the economics of trade cooperation and trade agreements, it abstracted from geopolitics. And in order to address that gap, we draw on the international relations literature And in particular, the realist school, which is associated with the work of Meyer, where the argument is that rivalry among countries is concerned with relative rather than absolute power. I'll come back to this question in a minute, but we also acknowledge and integrate in our paper the view of Hirschman, which is essentially that foreign trade leads to relationships of dependence and influence between nations. This is the work that we just heard Penny talk about, the quest for resilience. We heard the other paper about export restrictions in minerals, and they are also a source of power. But we focus primarily on geopolitical rivalry as a quest for relative power and hence dominance. So we show that our results are sensitive or robust to incorporating dependence as a source of power, but we focus primarily on dominance. We show, and our key and most surprising result is that the emergence of geopolitical rivalry does not undermine the case for trade cooperation. But there is a problem. The GATT-WTO system was designed to solve a different problem. It was designed to solve the problem of a non-cooperative NASH where each country had high tariffs. And the problem that we face is different in a way that I will explain when geopolitics is the relevant concern. And therefore, if the WTO is going to continue to play an important role as a forum for trade cooperation, its key principles will need to be adapted. I might as well spell out what these two key principles are at this stage. One is the notion of reciprocity. Reciprocity is that I make concessions in return for your concessions. So we both, for example, reduce tariffs and get to a better outcome for both of us. That's the notion of reciprocity. And the second is non-discrimination, which means that I treat all my trading partners in the same way. I'll show you why both these will need to be modified in a geopolitical world. And as I said, these findings are robust to quite wide interpretation of what geopolitics means. We take as a point of departure the standard neoclassical general equilibrium trade model: two countries, home and abroad, two goods, X imported by home, Y imported by foreign. Since I can communicate a lot of the intuition for our results, and Daria has only given me now 15 minutes or 16 minutes, I'll rush through all this. Home imposes tariff tau on imports of X, F similarly, prices are given. The key thing I want you to take away from, this idea is that if you look at PW, which is a measure of terms of trade, it's decreasing in home tariffs and increasing in foreign tariffs because of the way it is defined. The terms of trade, the PW, is defined as the ratio of home's import price to its export price. Now, this is key. This is what the welfare function looked like in an innocent world where geopolitics had not contaminated the minds of policymakers. Essentially, each country chose to maximize its welfare, and this objective could be quite wide. It could incorporate political economy considerations, but the key aspect was each government cared only about its own success in achieving them. For example, it could have been, as we have heard, that the country wanted its own semiconductor industry or its own shipbuilding industry. But all of that was really a focus on the well-being of the self, however defined. Now, to incorporate this realist school, we argue the simplest, nicest way of doing this is to introduce a concern about relative success. So we take now a geopolitical objective function, which is still concerned about the level of absolute welfare for each country, but is also concerned about welfare relative to that of the foreign country. This is the simple twist which helps us to see how geopolitics might affect what governments choose to maximize and what the implications are. How can we interpret this? In many ways, which suggests that it's quite a general way of thinking about geopolitical concerns. The simplest is to think of this as a concern, a rivalry over potential power. It could be about the size of my country relative to your country. And here you can interpret W as real national income. And again, the key difference is that if there were no geopolitics, each government would maximize its real national income with its tariff choice. In a geopolitical world, it is additionally concerned by its income relative to that of the foreign country. It could also, just to rush through this, if it could be a rivalry over actual military power. It could be about rivalry over the size of a strategic sector, whether it's semiconductors or shipbuilding. And again, the key thing is that we could easily have a partial equilibrium set up where you focused on these industries where there was strategic rivalry and there were other parts of the economy which were devoid of geopolitical concerns. Now, to set the stage, first consider what would happen if you ignore trade cooperation for a moment. What would happen to the non-cooperative tariffs in a world where countries now had an additional geopolitical concern? So supposing you had a non-cooperative Nash equilibrium where you previously only were thinking of your terms of trade externality, but now you have this additional concern that you care about lowering your rival's welfare. Now, just to move through it quickly, you can get the first order conditions from each reaction curve. And the proposition here is that the coming of geopolitical rivalry means that at least one, if not both countries raise their tariffs. And the intuition is very easy. If you start from an original Nash, where each government is at its optimal level, indifferent to a small increase in its tariff, the introduction of rivalry means that now it has an incentive to hurt its rival. Therefore, relative to that non-geopolitical Nash, tariffs are likely to be higher. Point one. Point two, now let's stay and just do a quick recap of the Bagwell and Steger world and see what efficient tariffs look like in the absence of rivalry. Here again, the story is relatively simple, and in order to identify efficient tariffs, we simply maximize the welfare of one country subject to some feasible level of welfare of the other country, form the Lagrangian, take the first order conditions, and arrive at this condition which will look familiar to you, which basically says the relative impact of foreign and domestic tariffs or marginal impact on home welfare must be equalized to the relative marginal impact on the welfare of the rival country. It's easier to see this as a familiar picture that you'll see. Now, if you look at this picture for a second, Wn and Wn star, this is tariff space. This is the higher up you go, the higher that home tariff is. The more to the right you go, the higher the foreign country's tariff is. In a non-cooperative equilibrium, both countries set a positive tariff represented by the point N and associated with welfare levels Wn and W star N. These other indifference curves in tariff space, W1, W2, W3 for home, W1 star, W2 star, W3 star for foreign, the points of tangency of these curves trace out the EM efficiency locus, the Meyer locus, which is a combination of each tariff combination where it's impossible to make one country better off without making another country worse off. So think of it, it's an analog of like a production possibility frontier or whatever. So the countries start at N, and in the old Bagwell-Steger world, the part of this efficiency locus, which is bound by Wn and W star n, becomes the kind of space where you would have Pareto improving bargains. Any point along this stretch from here to here would make both countries better off relative to their Nash equilibrium. But I just want you to go back and see the simple condition which defines this efficiency locus. Now we turn to the geopolitical world. And here the twist, as I said, is that apart from this own welfare, there is this additional term, which is rho times the difference between your own welfare and that of the rival. You go through the same process again, and magically, what do you find? That you get exactly the same condition. I'll come back to the intuition of this in a second, but this condition essentially defines the Meyer locus. So the key proposition here is that the rise of geopolitical rivalry, and this is perhaps the rest follows a little bit obviously and intuitively. This is the surprising result, that the rise of geopolitical rivalry leaves the set of internationally efficient tariff pairs unchanged. It's not the specific point, which is the outcome of bargaining, that's unchanged. It's that set of candidates for an optimal or the efficiency locus is unchanged when geopolitical concerns come in. You know, I think the simplest way to understand this is you can say, let me just, instead of inflicting the math on you, tell you a little story that my mother told me a long time ago. And when I was little, we found it both funny and perverse. It's about a man who prays for years to the gods and is finally given the boon that he can have anything he wants. But his neighbor will get twice as much. So he asks for a house, a beautiful house, and his neighbor gets 2 houses. He asks for a beautiful wife, and his neighbor gets 2 wives. And up to a point, he's very happy about his own improved state. But then he finds it unbearable that his relationship with his neighbor is becoming unequal in multiple dimensions. At this point, he says, God, take away one of my eyes so that his neighbor is completely blinded. Take away one of my arms so his neighbor loses both arms. This is the essence of geopolitical rivalry. The idea being that you're willing to accept some pain if it is going to make your rival even more worse off. And that's the contrast with the pure welfare maximizer who is willing to accept some gain even if the rival benefits a lot. It's the innocent United States which says, so what if the China is going to grow 5 times larger? We are better off because of trade with China. As opposed to a place where the United States says, we are willing to incur an economic cost today in order to ensure that China suffers more. But the twist is, if the concern were only with the relative welfare, then there would be no scope for cooperation. As long as you have this term here, which is some concern for your own well-being, in effect, that's what is the intuition for why a role for trade policy cooperation persists in the presence of geopolitical rivalry. It would disappear if domination was the only concern, if maintaining inequality in your favor was the only concern. As long as you care a little bit about your own well-being, you have still gains from cooperation. And that is really the challenge now. The challenge is the rivalry will alter the Nash threat point. Because remember, you're not innocent. Both of you now care to varying degrees about relative well-being. So that rho times W minus W star or rho times W star minus W has in a way changed the non-cooperative equilibrium, which we see as a threat point. But the internationally efficient pair of tariffs is unchanged. So this is how you were. You were at a Nash equilibrium in the past, and this is the efficiency locus stretch that I defined to you now in welfare space rather than in tariff space. And let's say B1 was the outcome of your previous bargaining. You can think of this as a Nash bargaining solution, for example. The problem is that to maintain cooperation when geopolitical rivalry erupts, the new Nash is different. The efficiency locus is the same. So you can see that subject to a new Nash, the bargaining solution changes from B1 to B2. And that creates a new challenge because governments must now find a way to move along the efficiency locus. Now, classical trade negotiations were you cut your tariffs, I'll cut my tariffs. As you saw in this picture here, both countries were cutting their tariffs and getting from the Nash to the efficient new bargaining outcome. In this new world, the problem is that you have to move along. Now, if both countries have positive tariffs, it could be that one cuts and the other raises its tariffs. If both are at zero, it could be that one subsidizes and the other increases its tariffs. And that poses a challenge for the multilateral trading system because now there are two alternatives. One is that you start from B1, you go through a period of trade conflict, both of you raise your tariffs, make each other worse off, come back to the new Nash, and then play by the rules, the old rules. Each cuts its tariffs and you come what we call war and redemption. From B1, the original, you fight, increase tariffs, come to a new Nash, and then do the old reciprocal cuts and come back to the new B2. This is a costly, painful process. Ideally, you'd be moved simply from B1 to B2, but that means sacrificing the first WTO norm, which is reciprocity, which meant that both countries make concessions. Here, one would have to make concessions to move along. But please note, both are better off at B2 than they would be at N2. But B2 represents a lower level of welfare for home here in this story than B1. So it is not a trivial shift, and it requires a departure from the norms. Now, let me quickly rush to one more point. I'll skip this dependence and say to you that there's one more concern that arises. In a bilateral world with just two countries, there is also a challenge of if you move along that efficiency locus, it requires countries to change their tariffs or subsidies in order to engineer that move along the efficiency locus. I'm about to finish, Darya, if that's what your message says. 2 minutes. Now, if you stick to MFN, non-discrimination, that change in tariffs and or subsidies that's required to move along the efficiency locus will affect all other countries, not just the geopolitical rival. Therefore, the only way to keep other countries unaffected by geopolitical rivalry would require a departure from the non-discrimination principle so that the rivals can make these adjustments vis-a-vis each other alone and leave the rest of the world unaffected. So that is the proposition here, that you also need to depart from MFN if geopolitical rivalry has to be accommodated without affecting other countries. I won't spend more time, but this might sound like fantasy, but it isn't so different from what we are seeing. What we first saw in 2020, after a trade war threatened to erupt between the US and China, China agreed to change its policy vis-a-vis the US, give it preferential access, buy more, and sell less to the United States. This was the phase one agreement. And in fact, that phase one agreement also affected the rest of the world, because this privileged arrangement was in a way detrimental. As work we did with Carolyn using a CG model showed that the rest of the world was worse off because of that deal between the United States and China. Now, the key element here is that even the most recent configuration between the US and China, where again there was an escalation of tariffs between the two countries, but then they began to bargain, is not unlike the predictions of our story, that these two rivals are maybe start going down the path away from the efficiency locus to the mutually destructive Nash, but then stop and start bargaining and engineer a movement along the efficiency locus. Arguably, there is greater symmetry of power now than there was in 2020, where China was accepting a new bargaining outcome where it was giving up welfare. Here, the things that we have heard, the sources of power, which derive not just from, mutual aversion, but also from the fact of power through export restrictions, has created greater symmetry. So one idea here is that how does the world go on when two countries are determined or at loggerheads? So one idea we propose is that just as the WTO system allowed an exemption from the non-discrimination principle for regional agreements to accommodate greater mutual affinity, as for example in NAFTA or in Mercosur or in the European Union, perhaps there is a need now to have a kind of geopolitical MFN exception which accommodates greater mutual aversion between two countries. And that might be a way in which we ensure the stability of the system and the world goes on. To conclude quickly, until the beginning of the century, GATT-WTO worked. Bagwell and Steger provided a compelling explanation. It showed that as long as countries maximize their own well-being, GATT-WTO principles facilitate mutually beneficial cooperation. Now, heightened geopolitical rivalry undermine WTO. Simple transposition would say this is, impossible match. Geopolitics and trade cooperation are not compatible. What we show is that this is only true if geopolitical rivalry eclipses any consideration of your own well-being. As long as countries care even a little bit about their well-being, there are still gains from trade cooperation, but the WTO needs to adapt if it is to still be a forum for mutually beneficial cooperation. Thank you very, very much. I hope this made sense, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Fantastic. So, Chad,
I'm muted, so
I will give you the pointer.
I was muted, so I deprived myself of the time of hearing your clapping. So, but now it is disposed.
Here, but right there. You know the place more than me.
Yeah. So thank you for the invitation to join. It's a huge pleasure to be back home. I don't know, one of my homes. So this is a when I got asked to discuss this paper, it was a little awkward for a couple of reasons. I'm a Steger student. I grew up in the Bagwell-Steger world. It's kind of the only world that I know. It's the only theoretical model that I understand. Aaditya is my former boss. And I once had to share an office with Michaela at the WTO. So a lot of, if I have negative things to say about this paper, it's not going to go well. And then having been in the world of policy for the last couple of years, getting a paper from some theorists telling me how the world is really, really working, I was not optimistic that this was going to go well. That being said, when I read the paper and digested what they had to say, a huge relief just came over my entire body, and not because I was not going to have to say bad things. It was like, now it makes sense, right? This paper is so good, at least in terms of helping me rationalize my own thinking about the world. And as a non-theorist, I couldn't process really my own thoughts in terms of this model. So if you haven't yet, please do read the paper. Obviously, read all of Bagwell and Steger's stuff. You have to before you really understand this paper. And I've had to read all of it, so I'm there. But it's really, really good. Okay, so what do they do? And I'll try to get through this quickly. And if Aaditya, at the end, if you can hear me, I'll clap for you, just so you can hear somebody clapping. Okay, so they basically 5 things. They help us think about the scope of the problem of geopolitics by setting up kind of the Bagwell-Steger model and that we're all familiar with, and by all I mean me and Emily and Penny and Michaela and what other Bob students do we have here? Phil, yeah, Carolyn, right, so, and Bagwell too, right, we're forced to though. They show there's still gains from cooperation, except in a limiting case when countries really, really dislike each other, and that's going to be important. They show us features of the new equilibrium that we're going to be confronted with in this geopolitical world and how it compares to the old equilibrium. And then, and what really struck me, and Aaditya did a great job explaining this, so I have very little work to do here, the intuition for why what we have hung our hats on as economists in this Bagwell-Steger world for so long, these efficiency-enhancing properties of reciprocity and MFN and how great they are, how they just don't work in solving this particular problem for us, getting us from the old equilibrium to this new equilibrium when we have geopolitics. And once, I just felt so much better about myself after I saw this result, that it's like, it's not you, Chad, right? There wasn't an obvious answer out there to fix it. Okay, so what do? So, Aditya's already done through this, but I'm not going to show you any math, just the intuition. If you start off with a very straightforward first Bagwell and Steger AER 2-country model, instead of having the standard government welfare function where they just care about themselves, you care about your welfare and the level, the novelty that gets introduced here is you also care about your relative welfare of you and the trading partner, you and the rival, right? And you're going to weight it by this thing called rho. And so why might you care about this? Why might you care about this? Is the Mearsheimer and these politicals. Do we have any political scientists in the room? So first of all, we should, because it turns out at some level they were right all along. Like, they don't have to model things always the right way, but they tell us how to think about the world oftentimes in exactly the right way. And so there's a lot to learn from them in this context. So here, intuition, suppose there's a possibility of war. And the probability of war is dependent on the relative sizes of the two economies, right? And so that's Aditya's, I'll poke one of my eyes out, so you poke both of your eyes out, that's going to give me greater chance of beating you in a war kind of thing. Like that's one of the possible intuitions here driving this. Okay, so the basic setup, just slightly different from the kind of standard Bagwell and Steger model. That's it, right? But you get really some insightful results here. So the first is, there are no gains to cooperation when all you care about is relative welfare, when all you care about is hurting the other guy, effectively, right? There's just no gains from cooperation. But anything short of that, so if you care about yourself in the levels, even just a little bit, there are gains from cooperation, right? And I saw that and I said, oh, that's amazing. Okay, that's good news. So the world is, like there's still for us optimists that want to always find a way to cooperate, there's still something out there that can be done, right? So that was kind of the first good news there. But, and this is the bad news and the intuition here. The question is, so B1 is the initial equilibrium, right? And so you can think about N1, this was like, Smoot-Hawley, 1930s, beggar thy neighbor policies. We're all starting from Nash. We use the GATT WTO system over the next 70 years to get from N1 to B1, to get to the efficiency frontier. Now we have this geopolitical shock, right? China, Russia, US not getting along, what have you. The new point on the efficiency frontier is B2, but the new Nash, right, the non-cooperative equilibrium has moved. It's not N1 anymore, but given the fundamental elements of the model, it's going to be N2. So the question is, how do we get from B1 to B2? Right? Do we have to go all the way back to Nash, to N2, trade war, or can we get there directly, right? And at the moment, it seems to be we're heading toward the N2 version, right? That we're going through trade conflict, and the question, I think, is kind of, can we arrest that, then head back toward B2, or are we going to go all the way back to the new Nash? Okay, so the bad news is, unfortunately, getting the bad news from the perspective of kind of the trading system and everybody who's known and loved the reciprocity principle and the MFN principle is they're not going to help you get from B1 to B2 here, right? So these trade-offs that Aaditya talked about is, initially starting from Smoot-Hawley in the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of the 1930s, how we got to relatively open trade in the Bagwell-Stegall world was trading off my tariff cut against your tariff cut, and that neutralized the terms of trade, the international externality impact of these things, and that's why we loved it. And then you split it up to multiple countries, and you have MFN too to kind of neutralize that. And the challenge is you have to suspend those particular principles in order to get from B1 to B2 to stay on the efficiency frontier, at least. If you're going to say to yourself, no, we're going to live by those reciprocity and MFN principles, well, that's fine. But then what you're going to do is you're going to go to N2 first, right? You're going to go back to you're going to go to the new Nash. You're going to have a trade war, and then you can use them to get back to the new efficient outcome the hard way. But if you want to get there the easy way or the less costly way, you're going to have to suspend them, right? And that's really the key intuition that comes out of their paper, and it's kind of so important here, right? And that's basically where I'll leave you. And this is a quibble, and this is not a quibble with their paper. Their paper is really clear what it is they're trying to do. My only quibble is we can't forget that there's a lot of other challenges when we're thinking about China in the rules-based trading system. There were a lot of other challenges with China aside from the geopolitical one, right? It's non-market economy. We had difficulties kind of rationalizing how and I'm looking at Annabelle and I'm blaming her as the former deputy director of the WTO for causing this. There's fundamental other challenges that we're going to have to deal with too, even if we can get past this geopolitical point. So this isn't going to solve, nobody should be, rest assured that this is going to solve all the challenges out there of China in the trading system. The other ones are more maybe economic in nature. So that's just a minor quibble. Bob's got some ideas in his book about potentially modifying WTO rules to deal with those kinds of challenges. But I just don't want policymakers to think if we fix geopolitics, that'll be it. Okay, so to conclude, I had this question. So what I've been doing for the last 6 months is writing a book with my old podcast partner, Samaya Keynes. It's called How to Win a Trade War. We're working on the conclusion this week. If anybody has an idea about how to win a trade war, there's still time to get your thoughts in. But from reading Mattoo, Ruta, and Steger, now I know something. I don't think I know how to win a trade war, but I know a lot more about rationalizing the discomfort that I was feeling about where we were in the world right now in I think a productive way. So really, really nice paper. I think it makes a major contribution. Aaditya, can you hear us? No, he's probably gone.
Chad, I'm overwhelmed by your reaction. Thank you.
Great. That's it. Thank you.
Perfect. So we will collect a few questions, and then we will get back to Aaditya. And in the room, Aaditya, there is Mikhail as well, if you want to make him work a bit. So Penny.
First, let me say I had the same reaction as Chad when I first read the paper, that finally there is a paper that provides an explanation for what's happening. But I also think it has a very optimistic take in the sense that there is an end to what's happening, there is a way to rationalize it, and there is a way to get back to the efficiency frontier. And on top of that, Bob is now the chief economist of the WTO, so perhaps he can implement the approach needed to go from B1 to B2. So my question and my concern is the following, that, this presumes, if I understand it correctly, that there is some shock that leads us to go from B1 to a new Nash equilibrium, and then you need to find a new point on the efficiency frontier that is associated with a different distribution of welfare across the two countries. But what happens, how do we know that such a B2 exists in the first place when you have continuously changing circumstances? So, for example, you can think of the invasion of Ukraine as being a particular event that triggered everything. On the other hand, if you think that the real issue is the ascent of China, right, that the fact that the distance between the US and China is declining, this is not going to go away. So we go back to B2, and then the next year there is another war, so we can go back to B3. So how do we think about a case where there is always an incentive to depart from the efficiency frontier because we do care about relative welfare?
Just one remark and one quick question. So I was playing with some models around the time of these tariff wars and I sent some figures to Aaditya, and he responded back by sending me this paper. So if you run these in a model, you get exactly what they find. And my question is, if there is a small country, they won't care as much about domination because because they have less power to hurt. So their weight on that part of the equation will be smaller. On top of that, their optimal tariff is closer to zero. So then how does a small country fight with the bully?
Comment and a question. So the comment, and this is for everybody, I just noticed that the second cover of Chad and Sumaya's book seems to have a Meyer locus, so that's got to be a record for a public interest publication to have that. I think it's amazing as a Bagwell-Steger student. The other thing, more seriously, this is a really great paper. Love what it's doing. It's very clear about what it's doing. It might not be crazy to say a little bit more about what problems it's not taking on. So it's talking about the Mearsheimer concerns about how would you factor in a preference for relative economic power or welfare, W versus W star. But a lot of what's happening now in geopolitics is concerns around leverage and the accumulation of leverage, not only by one adversary versus another, but also by your adversary over third parties. And that's not something that this paper can speak to. That's fine. I don't think you need to do that, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that third country dynamic is absent. And that's top of mind in a lot of the real life.
Thank you. I'm just curious about in the model you assume the government have the utility function is the economic well-being, but how you evaluate the national security and the vulnerability of relying the other trading partner, particularly if it's the rivalry countries. So does that take into consideration of the utility function in the end?
Thanks. So I probably couldn't catch with all the math, although the second time I'm seeing this presentation. Growing up, I guess, there was all these stories that the US overspent, basically forced the Soviet Union into military spending to the point that it crumbled the rest of its economy. The objective function in the paper seemed a little bit additive. So would the results change if we assume that rivalry leads to basically an economic loss in the rest of the economy, And to what point, basically, that would be the equilibrium, where one country capitulates and the other one wins.
Well, thanks. Let me add my great appreciation for the paper also. I think this riffs a little bit on Emily's point, but you have to think about what other members at the WTO will think, but also what they're doing. And so far, what most of them are doing is essentially insulating themselves from the U.S., just unilaterally agreeing to these deals. But they're trading with each other generally under the WTO rules. And yeah, there's always been tension around that. But does it affect your model if there's more than two players and the other players continue to play by the old rules because the power may not be as interesting to them? Now, there is historical examples in trade agreements, trade negotiations. In the Uruguay round, it was really US-EU around agriculture, right, and forcing other members to go along that. But the rise of India and other countries suggest that that would not be as easy going forward. So I really like the model, but if if many of the players in global trade stick by the old rules, you're going to have to buy them off somehow. And that might mean flexibility much more than just between the two powers. You might have to be giving flexibility to other members. I've got more comments, but I'll stop there and do it bilaterally.
So I know that there are other questions, but unfortunately we are very late, so I'll stop it here, and I hope those can be asked afterwards. So Aaditya, the floor is yours.
Michele, would you like to come in and say something?
No, please go ahead. If you don't want to answer a question, I'll get it.
Okay. No, first of all, thank you very much to Chad, to everybody. This is most reassuring. You work on these papers and you don't know whether you're stating the obvious or saying something interesting. And it's really rewarding at 2 a.m. at the night to hear good things. Thank you very much. So, Penny, I think you're absolutely right that this whole question of, multiple shocks is a recipe for instability. And it does raise the question, because they're not just international shocks. There might be, domestic political economy shocks. But what we look at is also, how are these these shocks that we are seeing now, how are they interestingly different from other types of shocks that occur? Which, in the sense that it's historically there have been shocks, but as long as there was scope for mutually beneficial concessions, we found solutions within the WTO system. But one idea is that the costliness of reverting to Nash and then coming back and negotiating up to the frontier would hopefully create some degree, as Chad was saying, that maybe some degree of stickiness and stability and not overreaction to shocks, where people see that small movements along the efficiency locus, the gains from them may not be worth the whole trauma that goes into the renegotiation. So perhaps, it's really only systemic shocks that are going to create the kind of pressures that we are dealing with. For example, the emergence of China as a major hegemonic rival, and the whole risk of the Thucydides trap. Erhan, I think the small countries are really spectators in this model. They have, they really don't have any power to set tariffs. But in your more quantitative model, I think you probably have a nice graduation of market power, and you can see what role there is for small countries. Emily, you're absolutely right. The geopolitics also involves leverage vis-a-vis third countries. There is interesting work done by Beko, Grossman, and Helpman, which looks especially at this question of, for example, how hegemons or one or two hegemons might change their policies vis-a-vis third countries to either induce them to join one alliance or at least deter them from joining the other ones. I think the question about rivalry in the utility function, you see, we are just thinking of that there is a welfare function, but you become geopolitically aware of relative well-being. So what goes into W could be, as I said, the size of your semiconductor industry, your shipbuilding industry, your arms industry. It's just that you care about it for geopolitical reasons, and it is possible that that partial geopolitical part of your overall objective function coexists with other parts which are pure utility, consumer welfare, and so on. But what we're looking at is how this dimension might affect your behavior. I guess, again, a very nice point about, again, it's the same idea. Think of a kind of set of partial equilibrium. There's the regular economy, there's the defense sector, all nested in an overall geopolitical thing. The point that you're making is, can it be that you devote so many resources to your arms industry that you starve the other parts of their economy, and that leads to overall collapse? I think that is also an interesting question. But in this structure, we're just focusing on the negative externalities that you're inflicting on rivals through your terms of trade. But I think your question raises a bigger point. Bob, I think if I understand your question, in effect, our prediction that the rest of the world will continue to behave as they have done and try and insulate insulate themselves from the geopolitical rivals is perhaps not an awkward description. But as Chad said right at the beginning, there are other issues involved with the rivalry with China, but also issues involved with other large developing countries, what we call in another paper that we did with Bob, the latecomer problem, which is also based on work that he had done with Kyle Bagwell, which is the idea that, asymmetric protection was acceptable in a world where there was huge asymmetries in size, where there were many of Erhan's small countries whose protection did not inflict any negative terms of trade externality. But the fact that these countries have grown, not just China, but India and Brazil, and retain, so that asymmetric protection, I think, is, Penny said this is the US bullying, and I think it is. But it is also true that the negative externalities inflicted on the US by a collection of large countries which have grown have changed the nature of the game. And so in some sense, when the US proposed not first difference reciprocity, but level reciprocity, I think there was a case for a new set of rules. But when it went on to then impose tariffs on other countries, it, in a way, perhaps was a step too far for the trading system. Michele, please feel free to improve or add, but I know we are running out of time, and I'm really, again, very grateful to all of you for the very thoughtful feedback.
Can I speak like this? Okay, everybody can hear me? Yeah, it's late, so I need to stand up, otherwise I'll fall asleep. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me in this program. The theme of the whole program is like, look outside. 5 years has passed. All these changes give us so much anxiety. But I look around the room. Look, 5 years has passed. Nothing much has changed, and I feel very happy. So happy to be here. Thank you, thank you. So the topic, well, these are all colleagues that we work together on the WDRs. That was fun time. The topic of my talk today is nickel steel cars, export ban and domestic value added in Indonesia. By the way, this is a directed research given to me by Indermeet over a meeting. He said that, Ki, I want to understand Indonesia export ban on nickel. Can you just go and study this? And then he gave me some little bit of budget, and then we dig into this. So this paper is controversial, so I need to say that all the views are ours, not representing the World Bank or the executive office or the country team for that matters. What is the motivation? I'm quoting a Filipino Senate president speaking on February 3rd, 2025. So this was just within this year. What we are looking at is to shift our policy from merely exporting raw materials that will be utilized by other countries to produce high-value products to developing our own processing capabilities. This will result in added value for minerals-related exports, provide a much-needed boost to our economy, and generate employment for our people. So the Filipinos Senate presidents were saying that they want to learn from Indonesia, start an export ban. In this case, it is also nickel, in order to add more value added in their domestic economy and generate jobs. So that provides the motivation, and Philippines is not the only countries that are trying to look at Indonesia's success. There are many African countries, even Latin American countries, that are already doing this by strategically ban their export of critical minerals in order to develop their local economy. So nickel, the subject of today's talk is on nickel. Nickel is a strategic minerals. It's a very important raw material for iron and steel industries, as well as currently for the green transition. It's very important for battery industries. And Indonesia happened to be the world's largest producer of nickel, even up to now. And it is also the world's largest, it has also endowed with the world's largest reserve of nickel. However, in year 2014, the Indonesian government announced that they will ban export of nickel, specifically ban the export of raw, unprocessed nickel, with the purpose of what they call downstreaming of nickel. Downstreaming is the term that they come up with, emphasizing that they want to keep the value of processing nickel within the local economy, help them develop the iron and steel industries that benefit the downstream iron and steel using industries. So there's a lot of laws, later on I'll talk about that, a lot of laws on and off for this export ban. And finally, it started off at 2014 that they have a hard break, stop the export of raw nickel, but then on and off until now. And also, as I said, for green transition, nickel is very important. So the question we have from Indomit is that, can this export ban on nickel jumpstart the Indonesian economic restructuring? They want to develop iron and steel, they want to develop downstream industries, and downstream industries like car industries, even textile, agriculture, constructions, electronics, toy industry, everybody use iron and steel one way or the other. So is the export ban successful? How do we judge whether this industrial policy is successful? How do we judge the successfulness of this economic restructuring? Is there any unintended cost to this? So this is what we are asking in this paper. So how do we do? How do we measure downstreaming of nickel? When Indomit gave me this question, I was scratching my head. How do we measure downstreaming of nickel? So we come up with this measure called domestic value added ratio in export. So this measure the downstream industries, how much of their export consists of domestic value added. If the downstreaming of nickel is successful, then we should observe those downstream industries like cars industries or toys industries or electronics industries, machine industries. They will start to use more domestic iron and steel in their production such that their export will show more domestic value added. So this is a yardstick we use to measure whether the downstreaming of nickel is successful. And to measure the hidden costs, we use aggregate productivity proxied by average firm size of the industries. And we construct a theory. Since this is a complicated structure, we need to have a very upstream nickel industries and they have a midstream iron and steel industries, and a downstream, what we call the car industries, actually is car and car parts that use iron and steel. So we built a 3-sector model to see whether nickel ban in the very first upstream sector can affect the car sector's domestic value added in their export. And empirically, how do we do that? It's actually quite straightforward. We just use difference in difference analysis, comparing the time series movement of domestic value added ratio and firm size of iron and steel using industries relative to other industries that do not use iron and steel, and look at the time series, see whether around the time of nickel export ban, do we see any changes in these yardstick variables. And to get the domestic value added ratio at firm level, we need to use a new methodology that I play with in the past year. Using the Chinese custom transaction data, we estimated the export production function, export revenue function of China, and to use that to calculate domestic value added ratio. I won't spend any time on that, just assume that what I did is correct in that paper. But this paper, I want to focus on Indonesia. So, and for productivity, because the data is not good, there's no way to estimate firm productivity, so we just use firm size, given that in the theoretical model, firm size and firm productivity are almost isomorphic. So they track well with each other, so we just look at firm size. Using total employment, even total sales or total export based on the manufacturing census as well as custom data. So for data, the main data set is the custom transaction data of Indonesia, very detailed. And then we supplement that with, but the time series is only 2015 to 2022. And the export ban started in 2014, so this is not good enough. So we have to supplement with other data sets, including this large and medium-sized manufacturing survey data, as well that provide different cross-sectional data that we need to link together. And then since we're talking about nickel, we need to look at minerals data, price data. So all those are from standard sources. So this is an interesting part, nickel. What is nickel? Nickel is the 5th most common element on Earth. So it is not that rare, but nickel is just difficult to get to. And primary use is to produce iron and steel and other alloys, and as well as to use as a chemical for the batteries production. So currently, most of the nickel is used for iron and steel production, but the fastest growing sector is actually the batteries producing sector. For the purpose of this paper, for Indonesia, currently Indonesia tried to develop the battery sector, but their EV sector is actually using lithium batteries rather than nickel-based batteries. So this is not very relevant for Indonesia, so we focus on iron and steel. So to meet the global demand in nickel, they are mainly coming from 2 sources. Either you dig it out from the ground using fresh ores, or you use recycled materials. And for the geography of geographical properties of nickel, there's laterite nickels as well as sulfide nickel. And for Indonesia, mostly they have is the first one, the laterite nickel. So this is a distribution. You can see that Indonesia is over here. Well, I don't know how to open. Well, Indonesia is over here. So all the yellow dots here is all Indonesia. So it has the world's largest reserve as well as it's the world's largest producer. Before 2014, it's the world's largest exporter until they just stopped. So you can see that this is a dramatic change for the world market. For nickel first use, as I say, most of them are used for iron and steel, 65%. Only 17% is to produce batteries. And this is first use, meaning once you dig it out from the ground, you go through the processing, then you feed into produce iron and steel. And then once you produce iron and steel or batteries, what else is the end use? The most downstream sector, you can see that it is actually very well represented. A lot of it used in consumer goods, as I say, even for food processing sector, you still use iron and steel. You use a lot in cars industry, the transportation sector, and then you use a lot in construction sector. Construction sector, 12% there. So iron and steel is very important feeding into downstream sector. And these are the sector that, in terms of domestic value added, we will look at in our analysis, compared to other sectors that do not use iron and steel. So this just to show you that, sorry, my son, I'm in the presentation, sorry. Okay, so Indonesia produce a lot of nickel in the world market. And right around the time that they banned the nickel export, 2014, you see a drop in the total production as well as price of nickel in the world market, because, and then it climbed out later on. So this, as I say, the export ban come on and off. So it is important to understand this in order to advise us on the econometrics model that we will use to capture the export ban. So it started off 2009, 2010, when the law passed, say that we will ban export of raw nickel, unprocessed raw nickel. But we have a 5 years buffer period. So at that time, they said that, okay, give you 5 years to build whatever capacity in order to process raw nickel, so such that after 5 years, you can start export processed nickel, or even better, to export iron and steel products. So, and around that time, in 2013, China also announced that they have this 21st Century Maritime Silk Road Initiative. So that give incentive for Chinese firms to invest overall. And many of them actually just because they are using, they are into the smoldering industries, they just come to Indonesia to start the middle sector, the iron and steel sector. So in 2014, 5 years passed, Indonesia government really have a hard break on saying that they will ban export of unprocessed nickel. And then unless the firms have their smelters built out in Indonesia and they pay an export tax, otherwise nobody can export any nickel. But then because of this very difficult environment, the government realized that their tax revenue dropped a lot and a lot of firms just went out of business because they cannot export anymore. So in 2017, they reversed course. They said, okay, fine, we'll let you export some nickel. Only qualified firms can export raw nickel. And then in 2018, they announced that in 2022, they will still stop export of raw nickel. But then COVID hit in 2020. And then the government said, might as well, we'll just ban export of nickel altogether. So there's this on and off period of time that you can export nickel, you cannot export nickel, you encourage domestic smoldering industry, iron and steel industry. So for our analysis, it becomes more problematic if we just set a policy change year at 2014. Rather than just set a policy year change there, we just choose to look at the time series movement for the whole period of time to see whether the iron and steel using industries behave any differently for this whole period of time. See whether it will pick up anything interesting. So I will not give you any equations for the 3 sector models. The intuition is actually very simple. We have 3 sectors. The upstream is a primary goods sector. The nickel sector, we assume is a monopoly producing nickel. Monopoly that sell in the domestic market as well as they can sell in the world market. Midstream is the steel firm, sector S. This is a monopoly. So they're facing the monopoly of a nickel producing firm, and then they use those domestic nickel to produce steel, and then they sell it to downstream industry, which is the car industry, which we model as infinitely many identical monopolistically competitive firms. So this is a Mellett's sector. the most downstream sector, the car sector. So it may feel very counterintuitive that the car sector is a monopolistic competition, but we think of it, it's not just cars, but car parts. You're talking about producing seat belts, producing car seats, producing nuts and bolts and things like that, so those car parts industries are all included. So the intuition of the model is that export ban on nickel caused the midstream steel firms who has the monopoly power to depress domestic nickel price to be lower than world price, and such that they use a cheaper domestic nickel to lower to produce cheaper domestic iron and steel. And with this cheaper domestic iron and steel feeding into the downstream car sector, car firms therefore can substitute imported steel with domestic steel. And therefore that leads to their domestic value added ratio being increased. And because of this protection of cheaper iron and steel domestically, you have a lot of small inefficient firms entering the car sector or the car parts sector, and that leads to aggregate productivity drop. So this is the Mallett's result. So in graph, it looks like this. So the model you can refer to in the paper, but the graph looks like this. The original point, this first nickel graph, the original point is at point A, where the Indonesia still exports nickel at world price, but and that leads steel equilibrium is at point A, and car equilibrium is also at point A. But nickel ban, export ban, drop the domestic price to PD, and that leads to increase in domestic supply demand of nickel because it's cheaper now, and that leads to lower price of iron and steel domestically, and therefore that leads to more production of cars downstream. So that leads to three hypotheses. So I won't repeat this because this is exactly what I say just now, that you have 2 minutes. I have downstream sector have higher domestic value added and have falling, and then you have lower aggregate productivity because you have inefficient firms entering the markets. So how do we test this? We estimate the domestic value added ratio for all firms, and then we compare and contrast iron and steel using firms versus other firms, and then we plot against the, interact with year dummies to plot out the coefficient. It looks like this. So remember, 2014 is the year that they start to have the policy change, but then they come on and off. In 2017, they reverse course, and then they continue this way. So it looks like in the first pass, it looks really that we can pick out that the iron and steel using firms does have an increase in domestic value added very clearly, particularly around 2014 and 2017, and it continue over there. And then in terms of the second hypothesis, how about productivity? You can see that before the export ban, the productivity of iron and steel using industries and other industries are about the same. But then post 2014 onwards, you can see that the firm size of the iron and steel industry become much smaller. And this is aligned with the hypothesis of the result. How about, if this is correct, then we should see a lot of entrants in the car industries. And the entrants show to be no different in terms of their domestic value added ratio as the non-entrants. However, their firm size are much smaller. So this is all in line with a theoretical prediction, as well as you see that the iron and steel industries have a much larger share of entrants relative to other industries. So all this have to be driven by changing in domestic price of iron and steel. And we did see this from 14 to about 17. You see the domestic price of iron and steel is dropping. So all these are collaborated with the field mission. We went to Indonesia in April this year, and we talked to the representative of various industries, including nickel, steel, and car firms. They all confirmed that our finding makes sense to them. So how big is the impact? Well, if you do the back of the envelope calculation, for this whole period of time, the export ban can explain about 1.1% increase in domestic value added ratio of the car using industries. This seems to be like a small number, but you have to remember that over this period of time, Indonesia is also open up. They have a huge rupiah depreciation, and that leads to a drop in their aggregate domestic value added ratio, whereas the iron and steel using industry actually observe an increase. So this is actually not that small after all. So conclusions and policy implications. Yes, we think that the export ban does achieve the downstreaming of nickel objective, but not without consequences. The consequences is that you artificially depress the local price of nickel, therefore leads to depress in local price of iron and steel. That leads to aggregate inefficiency because small firms enter the market. So for other countries like Philippines or Zambia that want to follow this suit, have to remember that you need to promote import competition in the furthest downstream industries in order to reduce the inefficiency created by this industrial policy. So that's all for me. Thank you.
All right, great. As with some of the other speakers, it is great to be here. I was here obviously for many years. I'm now at Georgetown. And when I got this paper, actually the first thing that I thought about was a trip that I took with then the new chief economist, Justin Lin, back in 2008. And it was his first trip, and it was to Nigeria and Ghana. And I got to be the staff member who went with him. And the people in the local offices quickly discovered that one of the things he really loves is chocolate. So when we were in Ghana, one of the things that we went to do, and of course he was interested in industrial policy, so we went to look at this new factory that had been set up. So Ghana had done a little bit different, but tried to require more domestic value added and production in Ghana before allowing, in this case, the export of cocoa beans. So European companies had come in. The difference was that they gave land, they put all kinds of infrastructure and tax breaks to be able to get this factory that was unbelievably capital intensive in Ghana that would roast the beans and chop them, but they were not willing to make the chocolate in Ghana because the key ingredient was the cream and butter, which was much better quality in Europe than it was in Ghana. So at enormous expense, they had this incredibly capital-intensive, isolated, no spillovers back to the local economy, but they were saying, you know, yes, because now we had more value added being put into Ghana. So I came at it with reminding myself of that different sort of story, what was happening here, what were firms really responding to. And so I appreciate all the data, having worked with some of the Indonesian firm-level data that goes into using this. Clearly, export controls, as we've been talking about all day, are in the news, now also being done by high-income countries with an idea to stop technology transfer. I would say for the developing countries, they're interested in using a host of trade policies to try and encourage their development, often with costly mistakes involved in that. So I think many of us around the table have been trying to talk some countries out of doing it. But understanding that they want to take advantage if they have some sort of strategic input, how might they be able to translate that into greater growth opportunities? So my questions here are going to be, how special is nickel? How special was the fact that demand for nickel was growing dramatically around in other countries, particularly in China, whereas the demand for the cocoa beans, people love chocolate, but it wasn't seen in quite the same way. How much was it the export ban directly or a little bit indirectly in attracting the Chinese firms to come and do the processing? And the fact that they came with better mining technology and an ability to really lower the cost of that processing, that the ban may have encouraged them to come into Indonesia, but that was really critical as to why the prices came down, the steel prices came down, and Indonesia was able to sort of stay in this market and see some of the gains although some of the gains in the sort of really downstream, maybe perhaps not quite as large. I think you give a lot of detail in the paper, which I thought was really interesting. I still think a little bit more context on what was going on in the market would be really interesting to see. I looked, because I was curious, particularly on this production going up to 50% of the world. Other data gives different numbers on that, that Indonesia was more like 5% of total trade in nickel. Now, this may be at different levels of aggregation, and I understand the quality of nickel in Indonesia is high. So this may be part of the mismatch. Indonesia certainly was able to increase that afterwards. You report here what the world price is. Curious if you could show what happened with the domestic price, particularly given you're making such a point about what happened with the domestic price and the fact that the price you show of the ore goes up so dramatically, including in the last few years of the data that you're looking at, without that same response. So you are arguing they make a big difference in responding to this change, but somehow don't respond to that change. And so whether you could unpack that a little bit more, I think would help on some of your story. You see in the downstream quote car sector, the steel using, that it has an opposite pattern of what's happening with the share of domestic value added being used compared to the economy overall. So something clearly is happening different in this sector. I guess I had a little bit of, some of the modeling choices might be generalized, and also then allow for asking slightly different questions as well. So if you've restricted the ability to export, and you have many fewer people who are, or firms that are going to be wanting to import it, use it, that the price would come down. It doesn't need necessarily to have that monopoly. To me, what was interesting is if the price is coming down, you're also arguing that some of the firms coming in are not quite as efficient. Yes, right? That's going to happen anytime there's these distortions and you keep some of the competition from coming on. The new firms coming in may well be smaller, may well be less efficient. And I guess my question was, is that's slightly true by assumption in your model because you have a symmetry across all the firms? But if you look at it purely from an empirical sense, is that actually true? Or do you find that the productive firms, in fact, are being able to take advantage of this? Because in, the slightly different trade data I was looking at, nickel exports from Indonesia tripled. Steel and iron went up by a factor of 20 times, right? So a huge increase in the export of the steel and ore, which you would expect if there's been this big improvement in the smelters and the Chinese, I'm assuming from your narrative, right, that it was the Chinese firms coming in that enabled both to have lower prices domestically and still be able to have such a surge in exports. Unfortunately, that sort of lower price didn't translate quite as much. You see a small increase in other steel using exports, your quote, broadly defined car sector. But you certainly saw this in that intermediate. But a chunk of that story wasn't directly the export ban, it was the bringing in the foreign investment and the higher technology. So I think in terms of telling that larger story, that might be something that would be useful to bring out. So my sort of recommendations in general really would be tell some of this larger story, how important was nickel, how important if you're considering an export ban, talking about unintended consequences, we don't want countries taking the lesson out of this that, oh yeah, export bans are really effective. It mattered that nickel was in super high demand. It mattered that they brought in, this was my other piece, of really bringing in the FDI dimension, the access to the new technology, why they might also be able to get some of these other gains, and whether you could use some other pieces of data to say something about the productivity. I will take that on average firms may be smaller. I'm not necessarily so sure that means that they were less efficient. And whether there's some other things in the data that you have that could bring out a little bit more, that could give a nuance about what was happening about the distribution of productivity across firms. And I'll stop there.
As there are very short questions, please, Anna.
Actually, I'm going to help Key answering some of Mary's thing, which is there is another mineral that was prohibited at the same time as nickel, which was bauxite, for which Indonesia was a very small producer, and it resulted in none of these effects. So I've told this to Key before, so she should use it too.
I was going to echo the same point on bauxite. In fact, there were, I think, 22 critical minerals that were first announced, and then, I don't know, like 5 of these export bans that went into place in 2014. It seems a little strange to focus on the one where we maybe saw movement and not the others. And actually, just to come back to that really great discussion, and again, great presentation too, is we can learn a lot by comparing. Where did bauxite fail? Why did it fail? Bauxite and aluminum require a lot of electricity. Indonesia's got a terrible grid. So just thinking about complementarity, I think it's really easy to bring in some sensible narratives in your study that would give us a sense of when industrial policy can work. Here are the necessary conditions. And I think that's an important message.
So, very nice paper. I wanted to second Mary's emphasis on the FDI by China, because my understanding was that China could get around all these controls if they invested, so it was a form of quid pro quo. That said, I think this is likely to backfire, because now if they want to export to the US, then they're in conflict with the US policy. So again, it shows all the challenges with industrial policy. But another question I have that applies not only to this paper, but to all these papers that show inefficient entry in response to industrial policy. I mean, clearly there is inefficient entry, and you get all these small, unproductive firms. But then eventually there's going to be consolidation, and if you let markets, prevail, and then in that case, the small, inefficient firms will be driven out of the market. And I might say, this is a better way of doing things, given that the government cannot pick winners and losers. No one knows in advance who's going to win. So let everyone come in and let the market decide who's best. So statically, it may be very inefficient, but from a dynamic point of view, why is this so bad? It's...
Thank you for the comments. I don't know how to respond. Okay, Mary's comment about the price of iron. Yes, actually, I don't have the graph with me, but if you, as I say, all this empirical result was collaborated with a field study, so in the field mission. So I don't have time to talk about that just now. Now I have a little bit of time, I can talk about that. So we actually went to the Nickel Association, and we talked to them, and then they say that Nickel Association was set up in year 2017, a fateful year, and the purpose of the association is to suggest a domestic price for nickel. So it's like a pseudo government association that the nickel miner, because they are being depressed by the FDI firms midstream for 4 or 5 years, and they are very angry, so they group out, form an association. They publish suggested price to the government every 2 weeks. So the Nickel Association Secretary General was very proud to say that they want to establish like a world cartel kind of body to publish suggested nickel price. It's some form of price control so that they can get some of the rent back from the FDI sector, the middle smuggling, the middle section, the iron and steel smuggling sector. So that is why you see that past 2017, the price of nickel, the price of domestic iron going up. So that is the first nice story. I was like, oh my gosh, this guy, we are studying economics, but we do not practice economics. Those are the miners, they do not study economics, but they practice economics, they practice the bargaining power and how to get rent out of the middle guy. So very smart. So that is the first thing. Second thing is that, yes, Penny's point about what's so bad about inefficiency in the short run that when you have small firms entering the market? Yes, I mean, it's true. We don't know. Right now, what we observe is we see that the average firm size of the iron and steel industry is small. And as I said, in the field mission, when we interview the car sector or car part sector, a lot of them are just few years old. They are specialized in producing car seats, seat belts, and they use local iron and steel in those, the buckle and all those things. Those are stainless steel. So yes, the cheaper iron and steel products allow these firms to stay, and whether they can gain from the infant industry argument and become more efficient down the road, we do not know. But one way to test would be to open up the market, the most downstream sector, encourage export, encourage entry or even FDI firms into the most downstream sector, use market forces competition to improve aggregate productivity. So that is actually part of the policy recommendation we put down in the paper when this paper was fiercely faced a lot of resistance when we first have it out. Thank you, Anna, for pointing out the both sides story. Yes, Indonesia, even up to now, they are very ambitious. They see their export ban on nickel being successful. They want to expand it to a lot of products, not just minerals. They even talk about coconut, talk about shrimp, talk about fish, a lot of other things. But then, yeah, so this is why the World Bank country team is very nervous about this paper, because they are worrying that the government will use this paper to say that, look, World Bank say it's successful, so therefore we can do this for other sectors. So I have to be very careful to say that the point of view of this paper do not represent the World Bank, and I shouldn't use the word success or good result in this paper, but or failure. Yes, I should stay neutral. Just tell you it's 1.1%. You can judge whether 1.1% is large or small. Well, it is statistically simple. Thank you.
I was kidding.
But it's true.